The Honourable Member for Scarborough Rouge Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's certainly my honour and privilege to speak today in support of Bill C-18, an act to amend the Rouge National Urban Park Act, the Parks Canada Act, and the Canada National Parks Act. Today I will spend my time focusing primarily on amendments to the Rouge National Urban Park Act, and I'll be splitting my time with my good friend from Scarborough, Guildwood. I must admit that this debate is one that's very close to my heart, not just because of the name of the riding includes Rouge Park, but because it is a place where many of my life's memories were created. It's a park where my two daughters planted trees, where we often go bike riding together in the summer, and it's where we as a family go to see the colors change in the fall. I'm not alone, Mr. Speaker. The Rouge Park is a place of great significance for the people from all across the Greater Toronto Area, and it is located within 1 hour of 20% of Canada's population. For those who have discovered it, it's a place of serenity that was famously captured by F.H. Varley, a member of Canada's Group of Seven, and one where over 1,700 species of plants, birds, fish, mammals, insects, reptiles, and amphibians live. For the majority of people who have not been to the park, it is theirs to discover. Last spring, our Prime Minister was at the Rouge Park for the annual Paddle de Rouge with his partner, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, and their daughter, Ella Grace. They were joined by the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and the Minister of Health. At the event, our PM said of the park, and I quote, it's a natural haven in the middle of a large city. That's pretty amazing, and it's something that should be protected. He went on to say, you know, when I talk to people about what it means to be a Canadian and the so-called Canadian identity, there are very few things that are echoed right across the country. Whether I'm in a big city or a small town, people always talk about nature, parks, and enjoying the great outdoors. Mr. Speaker, it is this Canadian identity that we're strengthening today. And what better way to remind Canadians of this identity than the lead up to our 150th birthday next year. What a great gift to the people who surround the park and to all Canadians. Mr. Speaker, Rouge Park is nestled in the Rouge River Valley between Scarborough and Pickering and expands north into Markham and the township of Uxbridge. Once completed, this beautiful park will span 79.1 square kilometres. It is Canada's first national urban park, and it is the result of countless years of work by community advocates. Let's take a moment to look at the history of the park and why C-18 is needed. The Rouge National Urban Park Act was passed by the previous government in 2015. However, the legislation did not meet, let alone exceed, protections that already existed under provincial law, thereby preventing the province of Ontario from transferring their lands to Parks Canada. The existing Act requires the Minister in the management of the park to take into consideration the protection of its natural ecosystems and cultural landscapes and the maintenance of its native wildlife and the health of those ecosystems. This fell far short of ensuring that ecological integrity of the park was protected and left safeguarding the park's ecology to the discretion of parks management. Under our Minister of Environment and Climate Change, she committed to ecological integrity. The Government of Ontario rightly refused to transfer their lands for the creation of the park until this commitment came to fruition. Grâce à l'adoption du projet de loi C-18, notre gouvernement améliorera la loi sur le parc urbain national de la Rouge et réalisera la vision qui les partisans du parc développement depuis des décennies. Un parc ayant l'intégrité et la durabilité écologique au centre de sa gestion. The Rouge Park is one of the very few locations left in southern Ontario where Carolinian forests still grow. The park contains incredible biodiversity and houses several threatened species, including the Blandings turtle, also known as the smiling turtle, and the red-shouldered hawk. The Rouge Park is also a place of great significance for the Indigenous people who have lived on this land. The ancestors of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations lived in the park, and the remains of some of the oldest known Indigenous villages in Canada are found in it. Our government has worked closely with the Mississaugas of the New Credit and its current chief, Stacey Laforme, in discussions leading up to this legislation. The preservation of these lands is not only important for the continuance of these ecological integrity, but also to protect the unique culture which it gave birth to. This bill recognizes some of the farmers in the park whose families have worked this land for generations. This bill will allow those farmers to continue to farm with some level of certainty. It will allow them to invest in much-needed equipment, borrow money for this equipment, and work on their farms like the generations before them. This legislation ensures that while farmers can continue to farm in their traditional lands, it must be consistent with our objective to preserve the park's ecological integrity. C-18 will expand the park and ensure that no development occurs on the forest and farmland within its borders. It will ensure that this land remains green amidst the ever-growing pressure for development from a growing population. By putting ecological integrity at the core of the Rouge National Urban Parks Management, we can protect the health of the Rouge Valley River in perpetuity. Mr. Speaker, I'm obliged to thank a number of people as this legislation is really a lifelong work for many. Permit me to take a moment to thank the generations of people who have worked to bring us to this day, where we will expand and protect this national treasure for the future. Mr. Speaker, the largest urban park in North America, in one of the most populated cities in the world, did not happen by accident. It came together because over the years, our governments, communities, and people worked hard to preserve and protect these lands. I want to start with Lois James, long considered the mother of the Rouge for her tireless advocacy. On August 5, 2003, she received the Order of Canada for her advocacy on the environment. At her induction ceremony, her work was summarized as follows. Lois James is a champion of the environment and a nemesis to those who seek to destroy it. She rallied and sustained public and political support in order to safeguard the Rouge Valley's flora and fauna, watershed, and wetlands. The Rouge remains a life work for many like Lois James, including my friend Jim Robb, Kevin O'Connor, and Gloria Resler from the Friends of the Rouge watershed. I want to acknowledge their work and intense advocacy on this issue. I know that FRW would have wanted us to go further on establishing an ecological corridor, but I sincerely believe that our commitments for environmental protection, as stated in this legislation, goes a very long way in meeting this objective. CPAWS and the many environmental organizations have advocated to protect the Rouge have worked very hard over the years. Many local community organizations, including the West Rouge Community Organization, the Centennial Community and Recreation Association, the Highland Creek Community Association, are integral partners in this endeavor as the park surrounds them. So are the dozens of other organizations that predate me, but are all nonetheless essential players, including the Save the Rouge Coalition. Mr. Speaker, most of the local politicians in Scarborough over the years have played a very important role in protecting the Rouge. I want to acknowledge my predecessors who represented the former riding of Scarborough Rouge River for their hard work over the years. I want to thank my good friend, mentor, and colleague, the Honourable John McKay, the MP for Scarborough-Guildwood, along with my Scarborough Caucus colleagues and the members of Parliament who surround the park for their persistent efforts. Our Ministers of Environment and Climate Change and her staff, along with the Minister of Health, have worked very hard to ensure that this park becomes a legacy of our Canada 150 celebrations. Let's admit it, Mr. Speaker, we would not be here if it were not for the great work of my friend, the Honourable Brad Duguid, the Ontario Minister of Economic Development and Growth, and Glenn Murray, the Ontario Minister of Environment. The province of Ontario is to be commended for protecting our environment and acting as a custodian of our park. Today, they are satisfied that our legislation meets or exceeds the provincial threshold for environmental protection. My most heartfelt thank you to all those who have made this happen. Ultimately, I want to thank the people of Scarborough Rouge Park for believing in a grander vision for our community and those working hard and at times alone to achieve this vision. You never gave up, and while we have achieved a milestone today, it is only the beginning. Your efforts need to continue as the park takes shape over our lifetime. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and really pleased to stand up and ask a question from my colleague. You know, certainly this is a very important park that's been created, and, you know, obviously we are part of the creation of this park. I would ask him if he's looked through the sort of definition on Parks Canada's website around ecological integrity, because certainly in Canada, the majority, all of our parks have been in very remote, isolated areas. So on one hand, they talk about the fact that this is great because it's so close to a huge majority of the population, but in actual fact, under the ecological integrity component, it really talks about limiting access to the park to sort of save the park. So, you know, I think you know, we appropriately said this is a different kind of park and we need to make sure farming's protected and we needed to make sure people had access. So leaving out those words in no way eroded the importance of the park, but did allow for, you know, the enjoyment and use by many.
The honourable member for Scarborough Rouge Park.
Certainly appreciate my friend's comments. I know ecological integrity was essential. When I spoke to dozens of groups and individuals over the past 3 years in the lead up to the discussion on the park and the bill before us today, the overwhelming feedback was that ecological integrity was front and center. In fact, I didn't speak to a single person who said otherwise. I think it's important when we look at new forms of new types of parks, such as urban parks, it's important that we keep to our core values. And ecological integrity, in my opinion, in our park system is absolutely core, and it's something that we will not compromise on. And I think it's important that this legislation recognizes it. In fact, if anything, there's people that are calling for this to be expanded even more. But I think this finds the right balance and to ensure that farming can still continue as well as other activities on the park.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his support for Rouge Park. You know, I was listening to some of the other uses of the park, and I was reflecting on the Group of 7 painting last night that sold for over $9 million at auction. Sometimes people don't give nature the credit that it's due in terms of its economic value in a number of ways. Today, the Friends of the Rouge issued a release, and there were 2 things that they're looking for in terms of potential amendments to the bill. First one was the implementation of pre-existing Greenbelt, Oak Ridges, Moraine, Rouge Park, and watershed plans. And the second was the addition of surrounding public lands to create a healthy and sustainable 100+ kilometers squared national Rouge Park. And I wonder if my friend and colleague would like to comment on those.
The honourable member for Scarborough Rouge Park.
Thank you to my friend and for his enormous advocacy and work on our parks. The Friends of the Rouge and I acknowledge them in my speech, are a group that have worked very hard over the years in getting us to this point. In fact, I would argue without them we wouldn't even be here today. I think their work and their continued advocacy is important. I think they've brought forward a number of suggestions over the years, and I too received the email this morning, and certainly I think our minister will give it due consideration. But I think it's important to understand that what we have today is the result of a number of important consultations, including with our First Nations people, including Friends of the Rouge, including a number of other environmental groups, as well as farmers. So this is a combination of all of that.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Cloverdale, Langley City.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member from Scarborough Rouge Park for his comments and dedication to this file. I particularly enjoyed hearing the personal experiences that he's had in Rouge Park. He spoke quite eloquently about ecological integrity and because it is a different sort of park and has the farming piece, I'd like to throw it as a member of the community if the member could comment on whether this legislation strikes that right balance between ecological integrity, traditional uses, and maintaining that rich experience that residents will be able to have as they have in the past.
The honourable member for Scarborough Rouge Park.
I'd like to thank my friend for those questions and his hard work over the years as a former manager of parks. It's very important to have ecological integrity. I mean, as someone who lives in the GTA I drive through the park virtually every day. I recognize the very difficult circumstances in which the park is developed, and I recognize that it is often impeded by human interaction, and we have a 407 highway going through it. We have a number of different infrastructure going through the park. But I think it's important to recognize that, connected to what we can see in Stanley Park and maybe even Central Park, where it is something that's preserved. So yes, it is hard. Ecological integrity is not easy. It is hard. It will require work, and it will require commitment on all levels of government to ensure that ecological integrity is at front and center of the park as we move forward.